I'm David Scheinman, and I was in a group called N34, 34th group that was in Nepal. We arrived in December 1972. I guess I got sworn in probably February or March 73, and wound up staying until April 1976. I lived in a village called Shabrubesi, which is at the confluence of two rivers which drain the high Himalayas, around 8 miles south of the Tibetan border. So I was the closest Peace Corps volunteer to the, well, officially it's the Chinese border, but we call it to the Tibetan border because that's where my cultural sympathies lie. And the Tibetans I was working with were all Tibetan refugees who just came over the border when the Chinese took over in the 50s. And there were a lot of indigenous Nepalese tribes people there who were Nepalese citizens who were called Tamangs. So that's who I worked with for 3.5 very, very happy years. And our village was around 5,000 feet. Everything else was higher than 5,000 feet. And I wound up working with farmers and developing apple orchards. Yeah, I was an extension worker, and the extension program up there really didn't exist. I mean, there was a district agricultural development office. And I noticed in Kathmandu there were a lot of apples that were selling, really briskly. They were very popular. And they came from Kashmir in India. And I knew that, apples are a, cold weather crop. They have to go into dormancy. So they need freezing, sub-freezing temperatures. I found out 900 hours below 32 degrees in, Pennsylvania, Washington State. And I started doing research, and I realized that there were some Israeli and some South African varieties that had been developed to grow in areas that weren't as cold as your traditional apple growing areas, like Israel and South Africa. I thought, hey, this might be a good fit. So the agricultural research station right outside of Kathmandu, it was a place called Kirtipur, and they actually had these apple varieties. And I talked to some farmers, and some of the more advanced farmers were interested. And I started planting apple trees up in, my area in a village called Berdeen, Kangjim, and there was a village in Barku. And that pretty much turned into my Peace Corps program, horticulture. And by the time I left, there were thousands of apple trees, and I went back in 1997, and there were still thousands of apple trees. And I found that someone had built a go-down, which is the Indian term for little warehouse, like a to store the apples. Another Peace Corps volunteer did that around 10 or 12 years after 86. Yeah, maybe 15 years after I left. And now they were into the second and third generation of apples. And what's great about it, they're good to eat, they're popular, they put money in people's pockets, which is really the bottom line. They don't take any other land out of production. You can plant crops below them and around them. But anyway, the other part of the story I wanted to tell you about Nepal is I lived in a trekking area, so I had Western friends, friends meaning people would come through, we'd have dinner together, I'd give them information, we'd hang out. But I did wind up having around 2 or 3 girlfriends who stayed with me for a number of months. And the villagers thought that was great. It's like, hey, what an upfront guy. They're single, he's in his 20s. They're in their 20s, they're the same culture. It's normal that they hang out together. And the girls, 2 French and 1 American, very interested in Tibetan culture, and they'd help me with my apples, and it was just as normal as apple pie. But Peace Corps didn't think so. So when it came time for me to ask for my 3rd year, they said, Scheinman, you're just up there having the time of your life, bonking these French girls. We heard about you. Up there in Longtong, and you're too far away for us to visit. And I said, that's not true. I said, yeah, I've had girlfriends. I'm not a monk. I'm not a hermit. And they said, why don't you, bring in some of your local leaders, and they're going to have to vouch for you. I said, fine. So my member of parliament, Dawafinzo Tamang, no national political leader in the then partyless panchayat system, and his local henchman, colleague or whatever. These were okay guys. He was actually the leading Tamang. He represented the Tamangs. The Tamangs were kind of marginalized. They didn't have very good educations. So consequently, he was like the guy who represented the Tamang interest. And maybe there's 500,000 million Tamangs. The Tamongs are known as, their porters, Bari Bokne Manches. They were the guys, bulky. I'll show you some pictures inside of Tamongs. That's very nice guys. So they went into the Peace Corps office one day, just marched right in and met with my APCD and said, we want this guy. He's planted apple trees. He makes huge contributions to the Langtang area. He speaks Nepali. He speaks Tibetan. He even speaks a little Tamang. He's a normal guy. I said, we think it would be really odd if, a single woman, a 25-year-old trekker came in and he wouldn't have tea with them, or they wanted to spend the night and he'd say, no, that's not allowed or something. And also Buddhist culture is much more flexible and loosey-goosey than traditional Hindu culture. So consequently, it's like, what's the deal? There's no deal. I mean, we're interested in evaluating him on his production, not on his social life. And it's not like they're, they don't run around the village with no clothes. We want him for another year. Peace Corps, fortunately, to their credit, said, okay, if you guys vouch for him, you're the local guys, you're the local leaders, we'll give him another year. Done. So I became the first volunteer that close to the Chinese border. And it turned out to be a phenomenal experience being a member of that community. And that also was really a part of why, I enjoyed it for many reasons. The apples was just one of many variables. But I stayed for 3.5 years, and one of the many reasons I stayed was just, I really became a part of those communities. I spoke Nepali, I spoke Tibetan, I became well known. I knew the slang, I knew the mannerisms, I knew the do's and the don'ts. So after my second year, I knew I just had to stay for a third year to really, really apply everything that I learned, because I was at the top of my game and I didn't want to leave in like the 4th inning. I wanted to go through the 9th inning and pitch a complete game. I could have stayed for 5 years, but that's not, Peace Corps doesn't like that. Other volunteer agencies like the Dutch, they'll put you there for 10 years because they're interested in results. Peace Corps is interested sometime in results, but more in having fresh Americans go over and kind of exposing themselves, so to speak. Like, we're Americans and this is what we're all about. And of course, the more you're there, the more you assume the values of the culture that you're working in, and the less American you are. And then even though you're more effective professionally, you're less interesting to Peace Corps. They would prefer, replacing you with a new guy who's just from the U.S. and can perpetuate our American values. So anyway, 3.5 years was the limit, and then I left after, in April 1976.